Hello everyone and welcome to this presentation. This presentation is for American Career College Occupational Therapy Assistant Program students only, so please stop here if you are not a student of the OTA program. If you are, welcome and thank you for listening. We are going to be talking about the cognitive disabilities theory and reviewing a little bit about how this theory came about and what it means for practice. So the cognitive disabilities theory was developed by an OT named Claudia Allen, and she believed that cognition, especially impaired cognition, affects how someone is able to perform daily tasks in their lives. And so this theory really takes a look at how impaired cognition affects task performance. And the idea here is that the way a person is thinking, especially when that thinking is disorganized, can impair the person's ability to actually get things done in their life. So when we talk about performance of motor actions, what we're talking about is not that the person can't do something because they don't have sufficient range of motion or because they don't have enough strength or endurance or anything related to actual motor skills, but the idea that to be able to complete certain motor skills, you need to be able to organize your thoughts and remember what you need to do or figure out what you need to do next. So, if someone has disorganization in their thinking, their motor actions are going to be disorganized or not as purposeful or successful as they might otherwise be. And kind of going along with this is the idea that you can actually determine how someone is thinking or their cognitive level by looking at what they're able to do in response to what she calls sensory cues. So the idea here is that someone is given directions either through demonstration or through a written diagram or some sort of step-by-step, line-by-line directions, or they're verbally told what to do. Those are all sensory cues. And so that input comes in, and the person who's typically cognitively functioning will be able to use that information to successfully perform the motor action required of them. But if they have deficits in cognition, then you're going to see that when you give the sensory cue, the motor action is not going to be successful or appropriate for the situation. So that should become a little bit clearer as we go through this. So this theory is based on some beliefs. The first is that if someone has a cognitive disability, they're not able to successfully adapt or potentially not able to successfully adapt to environmental demands. So what this means is that the environment demands certain things from us, such as if my sink starts leaking. Okay, that's something in the environment that is sort of demanding me to first notice it, second of all, to recognize that it's a problem in some way, and third, be able to come up with how am I going to solve this problem? How do I get that fixed? Okay, and it doesn't mean that I need to fix it myself. It just means that I need to be able to know what are the next steps that I should take. Okay, so someone who has a cognitive disability may not be able to do any one of that part of that scenario. Recognize that there's a problem, figure out that, or recognize that something's wrong, recognize that it's a problem that needs to get fixed and or be able to fix the problem. Okay? Um, so the next belief is that cognitive disabilities can be seen in those sorts of day-to-day situations, but that they can also be seen in a person's ability to do something like a craft. And crafts sort of play a big role in this theory for several different reasons. But generally speaking, the idea is that they can predict how the person is going to be able to cope with something like a leaky faucet, or let's say a broken lock on their front door, okay, which might be a little more unsafe than a leaky faucet. And the other theoretical belief is that people can actually be at risk of injury to themselves or to other people if they demonstrate these cognitive deficits. So a leaky sink in and of itself might not be too dangerous, but if the sink is stopped up and it's leaking a lot, it could potentially cause a flood, which, someone could slip and fall in the water or something like that. So it could potentially be a dangerous situation. A broken lock on the front door could be a dangerous situation. Using a knife incorrectly, dangerous situation. Okay, so these cognitive deficits actually can lead to someone being unsafe, and therefore we want to know how the person is functioning cognitively so that we can address safety and be sure that the person is as safe as they can be in their environment. So I mentioned a little bit about crafts already. Again, this theory operates under the assumption that performance and crafts can predict performance in day-to-day life. And there's a lot of research to back this up within this theory. Crafts are chosen because they're unfamiliar to many people, so they aren't something that someone has done over and over and over again. If someone is very familiar with a particular task, then asking them to do it doesn't help you look at new learning, and it doesn't help you look at problem solving. They're so used to the steps of something that it's not necessarily going to tell you anything about their cognition. So she's chosen crafts because you can usually find something that someone has not done before. And they're complicated enough that you can sort of assess how the person is thinking. Okay, so that's pretty much what I just said, that they offer some sort of measure of how the person can solve problems and process new information, because there's usually problems you encounter in more complex crafts, and there's new information coming in as you're given directions for this novel task. So Alan has identified these different levels of cognitive disability. She's got 6 levels, and within those 6 levels, she's got 26 modes. Okay, so the levels are 1 through 6. And that's how you're generally going to learn them, is level 1 looks like this, level 2 looks like this. But know that there are modes that include decimals. So 1.2, 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, 2.2, 2.4, 2. Okay, on and on. The decimal points give you a more sort of sensitive, specific look at the person's cognition. So a 1.2 is different than a 1.8. But when you're learning them, the levels, you're just going to look more broadly at level 1, for example. Okay, so Alan has identified 6 levels, and they go from the very, very basic to the more complex, more abstract thinking. And we'll go through these on the slides coming up too. So this is just kind of a glance at the 6 levels. I think it's helpful because it sort of helps you to identify how they're different and how they move from level 1 being very automatic up to level 6, which is definitely the most complex abstract thinking. Okay, so level one is automatic actions, relying primarily on, sorry, um, relying primarily on the autonomic nervous system. Level two is postural actions. So this is where you're starting to see awareness of the body itself. Manual actions moves to use of hands and how the person sort of uses their hands to manipulate things in their environment. Goal-directed actions becomes they're now using their hands to accomplish something. Exploratory actions now moves from I know what I need to do and can take it sort of step by step and do it to I can play around with this and see if I can explore and kind of figure out how to sort of solve this problem or create this thing. And six is planned actions because now the actions don't actually have to happen for the person to um, understand them. So they can sort of imagine things. They can think through if this happened, what could happen after that. They don't actually have to take that first step to know what might happen. They're able to sort of look at more hypothetical situations and manipulate things mentally without having to actually do them. Okay, so we're going to go through each one of these. Level one again is automatic actions. This level is the very, very basic of the levels. It's really the autonomic nervous system keeping the person alive. So it's going to be very, very basic functions with very little response or awareness of the external environment. So when we think about having someone imitate what we're asking them to do, lift your arm, put your arm like this, that sort of gross motor movement. The person's not going to be able to do that because they're not going to be aware of that external environment and what your sensory cue in your demonstration is. Pretty much all of the person's actions are going to be automatic. So they'll sniff, they'll swallow, they'll pull away if something is painful or noxious in some other way, doesn't smell good, that sort of thing. But they're not going to purposefully initiate any other kinds of actions. They're really responding only to the very, very basic bodily functions to stay alive. So hunger, thirst, discomfort. They are going to be mostly unaware of the surrounding environment. Typically are in bed with rails up because they're not going to be able to get out of bed or be safe in getting out of bed. They're going to be slow to respond. So when you're working with someone at a level one, you're going to use very, very basic verbs and physical contact to guide their movements. They're not going to be able to engage in crafts for sure, or any sort of gross motor movements that you're expecting without those very, very basic cues. Level one moves to postural actions. So this is where the person starts to become aware more of their body. So they may approximate imitations. So you could say, put your arm like this, and they can get their arm kind of close to what you're doing. They're going to be able to walk, to gesture, and stretch. They're getting most of their cues from their posture, from gestures and motions, very, very gross motor type movements. They are going to pay attention to gravity and to proprioceptive input, not a lot verbally. Okay, they're going to be aware of their movement and position. They can initiate some gross motor actions. So again, if you say, raise your arm like this, but they may wander and they may assume more bizarre postures. So in this case, you're looking to use pronouns and body parts. and guide their movements. For level 3, awareness moves now to what they're able to do with their hands manually. Okay, so we're looking at manual actions. So they're able to now imitate a little bit more of sort of the more detailed kind of fine motor movements in terms of more manual actions or movements with your hands. They may pick up or touch objects, and so they're now aware not only of the sort of if you're at level 2 having them raise your arm like this, but they're not at level 2 going to be aware of sort of objects in the room or that sort of thing. At level 3 now they are, and so they're going to pick things up, they're going to touch things, and you can use that to your advantage, but you also want to keep in mind that they may be distracted by things like that in their environment that they can pick up or touch, because most of the sort of input and information coming in to their brains and sort of how they're processing is a very um, manual input. They're going to be responsible at this level to tactile cues such as texture and shape. So again, because there's that input coming in through the hands, they're going to notice these different textures, notice different shapes. They're going to be interested in what's going on and the objects around them, but can be easily distracted by these things. And they're going to have a difficult time with cause and effect. So they're going to have a hard time understanding if you do this, then this happens. Um, so safety is of great concern, of course, in levels 1 and 2, but also in 3, because they aren't going to understand what might happen or what even does happen if they, for example, leave the front door open. Okay, they may not even notice that they've left the front door open, but then if someone comes in or it gets cold or something like that, they aren't necessarily going to tie that to, oh, it's because I left the door open. People at level 3 are pretty easily disoriented and can get lost, and they may easily forget things and repeat things over and over again. So at this level, when you're interacting, you want to use names of concrete objects. So don't talk about ideas, don't talk about things that they can't see or touch, but use those names and describe actions of the hands, because those are things they're going to understand in very concrete terms. At level 4, we move to goal-directed actions. So now they're able to not only pay attention to objects in terms of touching and feeling them and sort of manipulating them in ways, but actually now being able to copy or reproduce things that they've been given. And this copying and reproducing is going to be at a very concrete, sort of simple level. So if you ask the person to cut carrots, you're going to need to give them very clear directions about how thick you want the slices, for example, or that they need to first peel the carrot before they cut it. Okay, so they're going to be able to copy what you've given them with some attention to some of these details, but it's going to be at a very, very basic level. They're going to attend to some details that are visible and readily evident. So color, size, discomfort are things that they're going to pay attention to. You're going to need to give one-step directions. They're going to be able to visualize the goal, and they sort of need that vision in mind. So working with someone with level 4, you don't want to just say, oh, today we're going to be creating this craft, for example. You want a sample of the craft. You want at least a picture of what they're going to be doing, because they're going to use that to understand what's expected of them. You also, as much as possible, want to use two-dimensional projects versus 3, because People at level 4 attend to things that they can see. If you have a 3D project, such as, let's say, painting a jewelry box, when you look at something like a 3D box, there are two sides, at least two sides, that you cannot see, the bottom and the back, and maybe one of the sides too. So someone at this level isn't necessarily going to realize that there's a bottom and a back to be painted, for example. So two-dimensional projects that they can see all the different aspects of it are best. Okay, they're not going to be able to recognize errors, and they're not going to be able, or likely not going to be able to correct them. Okay, so they may not see that their project doesn't look like the sample project, that something has gone wrong. They're not necessarily going to be able to see that. So that's going to be then up to you to help point those things out and potentially to help them to solve that problem. Okay, they aren't going to be able to figure out, okay, I did this wrong, need to try it this way. When you're giving directions, use adjectives and adverbs because, again, people at level 4 are attentive to these kinds of cues. So saying things like the blue paint or the small paintbrush, that's going to help them to understand what objects you're talking about. And you may need to demonstrate actions so that they understand what needs to be accomplished. At level 5, the person is able to more explore things and try things out to figure out what they can do about certain problems or how they can accomplish certain tasks. So they're going to be experimenting and they're going to need to go through the trial and error process to figure out what works and what doesn't. They're going to be able to imitate new steps, so you can't necessarily expect that the person's just going to figure out how to, let's say, space tiles or blend makeup, but if you show them how to do it, they should be able to copy what you've shown them. They're going to be able to attend to relationships between two visible cues. So again, with level 4, the person wasn't necessarily understanding that something could be behind or under something else. At level 5, they're able to. So they can understand that something is overlapping and that there's something underneath the layer that goes over the top. Okay, they're going to understand that you can mix the red paint and the blue paint and get purple paint. Okay, they're going to understand that something is underneath something else or to the left of something else in those spatial relations. Level 5, their thinking remains pretty concrete and attentive to things that are most obvious. They're going to be able to do 3 familiar steps and 1 new one. So if you're giving directions, you want to be sure that you're keeping the new information to a minimum or it's going to be overwhelming. Use prepositions, so that's things like under, above, around, below. Give explanations, and you can include precautions and options. So someone at an exploratory level 5 is going to need to be told what to sort of be on the lookout for when it comes to things like safety or potential errors. But when told these things, they're going to be able to watch out for them and sometimes can avoid them. Level 6 is planned action. So at this stage, the person doesn't need to see you do something in order to be able to carry it out. They don't need to see imitation in order to figure out what do I need to do. Okay, so they're going to be able to do more complex tasks like planning budgets or building projects from a diagram. If you think about if you've ever had to build something from a diagram, it's a pretty abstract experience, right? Because you've got this 2D piece of paper that has pictures of pieces that you know are going to come together to build, let's say, a shelf. And that represent each individual, little tiny picture of this bolt and this screw and this piece of wood, that they represent actual physical, much larger three-dimensional objects. So there's a lot of abstract thinking in that this represents this other thing, and that all of these pieces put together turn into something entirely new. So someone at a level 6 will be able to do that. Will be able to look at a diagram and either follow sort of step by step or figure out, oh, this must go here because it's painted black on this side, or whatever the case may be. They're going to be able to attend to symbolic cues, so things that are more abstract or intangible. So again, something like that diagram can be pretty symbolic. This little drawing right here represents the big piece of wood that goes at the bottom of your shelf. Okay, someone at a level 6 is going to be able to anticipate errors and plan to avoid them. So they can sort of think through in their head, what might happen if I did this? Or I could see that there might be a problem if, I didn't do it this way. And therefore they can plan so that, okay, so I need to do it this other way instead. So when you give directions, add conjunctions and conjectures. You can give written directions or diagrams and expect that someone at level 6 is going to be able to follow it. Okay, so from a safety perspective, now that we've gone through all the different levels, it's important to understand that levels 1 through 4 should not be living in the community unassisted, because they're not going to be able to perform the necessary routine tasks. So someone at even a level 4 doesn't necessarily recognize problems or know how to solve them. So going back to the example of the either leaky faucet, or we can talk about the broken front door lock. If someone has a lock that's broken and they don't recognize that, that's going to be a problem for their safety. If they recognize it, but they say they can't think through that cause and effect of, if I leave my door unlocked, this might happen, right? Someone might come in. Bad things could happen if someone comes in. If they don't recognize that, then they're going to be unsafe. I mean, we wouldn't want a loved one, living in that sort of situation, right? Because you'd be concerned about them. So we would be concerned about someone's safety and their ability to recognize and handle those sorts of problems. So how do we know? How do we know what their level is and kind of what to do about it? So we use careful evaluation to do that. OTAs can participate in this evaluation, but it needs to be interpreted by an OTR, which is really the case with all assessments. Some of the tools that are used in the cognitive disabilities model include the Allen Cognitive Level Screen, or the LACLS, which is the large version of that. That's a leather lacing tool that you're probably familiar with, and it assesses levels 3 through 5. So levels 1 and 2, remember, the person isn't going to grasp things, they're not going to pay attention to what's in their hands. That kind of input isn't going to be successful or useful for the person. So at level 3, the person starts to have those manual actions, up to level 5, where they're able to sort of explore solving problems. The routine task inventory 2 is an ADL screening that's done through self-report or observation, and that gives you a cognitive level. as does the Cognitive Performance Test, or CPT. It takes a look at performance in structured tasks, and the Allen Diagnostic Module gives alternative tasks for reevaluation. So the idea here is that once someone has done a craft or an assessment, they may become familiar enough with it that it's not testing new learning. So the Allen Diagnostic Module gives you different crafts that can give you the same result. So you can offer something new to the person and still take a look at their new learning. So how do we treat this? If we know that someone is at a, let's say, lower cognitive level, what do we do about it? So within this model, there's a belief that cognitive levels are difficult, if not impossible, to change. So what then needs to happen, and you can kind of think of the PEO model as in this, that if we're not going to be able to change this client factor in the person, we're going to need to change something else about the environment so that their occupational performance improves. So environmental changes can enable improved functioning. And they say time as well. It's not something that we can really have much to do with, but sometimes people do improve cognitively with a lot of time. But from sort of a short-term perspective, the best bet is to change something in the environment so that the person is better able to function. And that can be something like a checklist, for example, or an alarm clock or a reminder that goes off so that the person knows, is reminded of something that they need to do or check. Um, or it can be support in some way, someone coming through and ensuring that they're in a safe environment on a regular basis. So we can also in treatment provide directions according to our knowledge of their cognitive level. So even if we're not treating cognition, we want to be aware of the person's cognitive level so that when we're working with them, even with more physical dysfunction, that you're able to give directions based on what they're going to be able to respond to. And you want to be able to design activities so that clients can understand and enjoy them. You don't want them to be too difficult. So knowing cognitive level helps with that. So what's OT's role in all of this? To identify that cognitive level through evaluation. Monitor changes. Medications can sometimes affect a person's ability to think clearly and in an organized way. Stress can do that. Some other things can do that as well, substances. So you want to pay attention to the person's cognitive level. Adapt the environment, as we've already talked about. So a couple of examples here, when you're doing an activity with someone who's at perhaps a level 3 or 4, we know that people at level 3 and 4 can be very distracted and may not understand that maybe there's things out in front of them on the table that they're not supposed to use right now. They're going to pick things up, they're going to touch them, they're not going to be able to understand that I need to wait and use this later on, and if I open the paint now, right, I could spill it or something bad could happen, and then I'm not going to be able to do whatever is expected of me down the road. So don't provide supplies until the person needs them. So this may mean that you sort of keep them under the desk or you keep them someplace else and you pull them out one by one as the steps require them. People at levels 3 and 4 also tend not to be able to share tools, partially because they're not necessarily going to be responsive to requests for them. So could you hand me the blue marker isn't necessarily something that a person, especially at level 3, is going to be able to attend to. So you want to give people individual sets. At level 5, then they're going to be capable of sharing. Okay, so that concludes this presentation. I hope it was helpful. Thank you for watching.